The MHTTC network uses affirming, respectful language and recovery-oriented language in all activities. This language is strength-based and hopeful, inclusive and accepting of diverse cultures, genders, perspectives, and experiences, healing, centered, and trauma-responsive, inviting to individuals participating in their own journeys, and person-first and free of labels. I'm going to pass it back over to Ashley and Renisha for the remainder of the session. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to get kicked off by starting off with a little bit of a reminder about who we are and what we covered last time. I'm passing it to Ronnie to introduce herself, then I'll introduce myself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ronnie Shahajat. I go by Ronnie. I am the Senior Project Manager at C4 Innovations, and so happy to be back here with you all again today. I see some familiar faces from our last session, so welcome back. And for those of you joining us for the first time, welcome.
And I'm Ashley Stewart. I'm the Director for the Center on Equity at C4 Innovations, joining from New Jersey, and really, really excited to be here. Would love to hear from folks in the chat. Anyone joining us for the first time this week? You weren't able to join last week, but you're joining us for the first time this week. Welcome, Pauline. So happy to have you. Other folks? Monica, nice to see you. Nice to see you. If folks could join me, David. If folks can, if your name's incorrect, feel welcome to rename yourself, or if there's a name you would like for us to use, please feel welcome to rename yourself. I'm going to ask that folks, like we did last week, introduce yourself in the chat, just so we can know who's in the room and what different organizations we represent. So if you could take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, that would be awesome. Really excited to have you. And so we're going to jump in today with some reintroducing to what we talked about last time. What did we cover? What's the plan? And what is a little bit about the workbook? And then we're going to talk about authenticity in the workbook today. We're going to get to see the workbook and go through the different components of it together, which is really exciting. We're also going to cover the second section of the workbook, which is identity and mental health. And time permitting, we're going to address microaggressions in the workplace. If we don't get to the addressing microaggressions in the workplace part today, no worries. We'll definitely come back to it in our final session next week. It's great to see everyone. Yes, so great question about where you can access the workbook. It will be publicly published after the completion of this web series, and you all will get it sent to you directly as for participating in it. So you're getting a sneak peek, the world premiere, if you will, today in the session. And then afterwards, once we complete the workshop next week, it'll be published for open use, for sharing, however you'd like to utilize it, even maybe even using your own organizations. So when we came together last time, 2 weeks ago, we started with these equity-centered and trauma-informed best practices. We talked about how this work is a journey. We talked about the importance of leaning in, of asking for clarification, acknowledging that we come to this work from very different places and spaces, that we encounter things very differently. And so being able to ask for clarification is very helpful in moving towards safer, more inclusive spaces. We also talked about the importance of embracing discomfort, recognizing that with growth, there are going to be places that we're stretched. There's going to be things that we haven't had experience talking about. And so as we think about what does it look like for culture change to happen at an organizational level, for systemic and structural norms to change at organizational levels, there's going to be some inherent discomfort. And so we really align with that, and we're very thoughtful around that. We like to say that this work is not for others. This work is for us. And so a lot of times we'll take information, we'll go and we'll tell other folks to do it. Well, in this space, we really want to honor that this work is for all of us to do. And we like to honor all experiences and expertise equally. Often when we talk about that, We align expertise with people who have learned knowledge. However, we like to honor lived experiences and lived expertise in this space. And so if you are coming to the space and any of the things that we're talking about are familiar, we encourage people to participate. It's Ronnie, Isabel, Kai, and I. So please feel welcome to use the chat throughout. It'll never be distracting. Have conversations, connect with one another. We encourage you to ask questions and during the whole time in the chat and to use that. Safe space and brave space. Some of the things that we'll talk about can really, feel really comfortable for some of us, but it might be more of a stretch for others of us. And so we like to create both safe and safe spaces. My favorite is revisiting welcome, acknowledging that things that we talked about 2 weeks ago are absolutely able to come back to the table today. If you have something you're reflecting on from the last session, bring it back up today. We want you to do that. As well as the same is true for the next week as well. Affirm and give credit. If someone in the group or and when we do our breakout rooms, if someone says something that really resonates with you, I encourage you to affirm and give each other credit. Revoke expert positioning, allowing ourselves to be in a space to learn. Listen to understand. Agreement is not always possible. And so we really want to listen to understand. To be accountable for the impact of our words. We're coming to the space to look at the importance of authenticity in the workplace. So there's a natural assumption that we're here to reduce harm as much as possible. And so navigating from that foundation that we're gathering resources to reduce harm, we can acknowledge that being accountable and holding each other accountable is a very kind thing to do. It's kind for Ronnie to let me know that something that I said may not have landed the way that I thought, or that a term that I'm using has some historically oppressive context to it, because it allows me to do it differently or acknowledge the harm that I caused. It's very kind of her. It's also very kind of her because it takes a lot of courage to let someone know. It's kind of me to receive that and then do something with it. And most importantly, it's kind to folks who will not be harmed by continuation of me using that term as an example. Want to be gentle with ourselves and other people and give ourselves grace. And we want to bring things here to challenge them so that we can acknowledge them. So all great things that we talked about last week. At that point, we then went through the different components. And we talked about why it's so essential to center equity. We talked about really cool statistics of a recent research study that showed that, to no one's surprise, in this group at least, that diversity was enhancing the performance of different organizations as part of this large study. But what we really got to when we started to dive through and peel the layers back of it is that diversity did not suggest or imply that inclusivity was felt. And even more dynamically than that, inclusivity does not ensure that there is equity present, which is looking at those gaps that exist and persist and being intentional about culture change. And so we started talking about what it would look like to center equity first, and to improve the workplace from a very genuine and thoughtful way. And then we introduced kind of the background, the history, the research, the conversations that help to build this idea to develop this authenticity guide for the workplace. And we went through the different components of it with the expectation that we would take a deeper dive today, not only to describe to you the contents and to go over the contents as a group, but also to talk about how to intentionally use it and apply it in the workplace for yourselves or for your organizations. And so that's what we're going to get into today. Again, this resource can be used as a tool to address the unique experiences of work-related stress, compounded with people's experiences, focusing on those with systemically structured marginalized identity. This workbook was designed to address and acknowledge the intersectional experiences for people of color in the workplace and what an equitable work environment will look like. And yeah, really excited to show it to you today.
So to start off our workbook, our first chapter centers around authenticity in the workplace, what that looks like, what it means to cultivate authenticity, some questions that you could consider, some important terms to help you define what that looks like, what kind of barriers may be in the way of folks showing up authentically as themselves in the workplace. So it really lays out that and gives you some real exercises that you can walk through with yourself and with others to define and refine and act out authenticity in the workplace.
And so we covered some of these quotes last time, but just to bring them back to center, why is it so important to talk about authenticity in the workplace, right? Have you ever felt like you spent a lot of time adjusting to where you are at work or who you are, changing your natural tone, adjusting your body posturing, worrying about how other people see you? And we began to talk about the complexity of energy that is energy depletion that happens when people are not able to be their most authentic self. And so some of the research produces some of these quotes that I wanted to bring to the group. Being authentic improves our productivity, increases performance and success. It allows people who work in a place, employees, right, to exert less energy and time censoring or hiding themselves. Indeed, employees often link these things like spending less time and energy on self-monitoring and freed up more time for the task at hand. And so we're really starting to look at what are the lived narratives of people who are sharing what it looks like when you're able to be your authentic self, how much more you can be invested and involved in the critical and important work that we're doing. If an environment feels threatening, we'll tend to conform in order to achieve a sense of protection and safety. Leaders who are willing to take this on benefit from more innovative, creative conversations, people feeling more confident and engaged because they're bringing their full selves to the workplace. And then a quote that we covered last week that I don't have on this slide today really got into some of the research about how people shared that they were able to be more innovative, creative, bold, right? Express empathy more when there is an opportunity to be your fullest self. And we also got into some of the nuance that we're not necessarily talking about, you know, some of our quirks and mannerisms, and those things should be welcomed in the workplace too. We're talking about aspects of people's identity that folks are reposturing their bodies to avoid hateful or hurtful comments, homophobic, transphobic comments. We're talking about people changing aspects of their identity, their hair, their tone, their physical body language to avoid different stereotypical or biased outcomes that not only impact their wellness in terms of the feeling that they get or the things that people say, but also impact their ability to have opportunities for promotion, for merit-based positions. These types of things are absolutely being influenced. In fact, we still look that half of the states in the US, it's still legal to discriminate against someone based on something as culturally relevant as hair, right? So we're really talking about critical components of people's identities above and beyond like the nuances of our personalities. Authenticity creates a work culture where people feel more in tune, connected to the community. They feel loyal to their organizations. They feel that they're able to connect more to the purpose of that organization. And this helps to attract and retain people who are able to do their best work. That's critical. When we work with organizations, a big thing that people often talk to us about is retention. And if authenticity or a person's ability to be themselves and experience wellness in the workplace is a barrier, that should be an urgent priority for us to address. When people don't have to cover up the differences that make them unique, then those differences are welcome. And again, you know, above and beyond how we generally talk about diversity, we're talking truly about multivariate inclusivity. We're talking about genuine appreciation for folks' identities and not superficial or performative siloed diversity efforts, which many of us are familiar with. And so I think here would be a great place to kind of recap what we talked about last time, but also get some input from folks who might be joining us for the first time. We have a Mentimeter, and I'm going to let Ronnie help us with that. But we do want to know, like, as we get ready to talk about cultural authenticity, want to know, like, what does that look like for you and your organization? So, Ronnie, you want to explain the mentors?
Yes, so I just dropped a link in the chat, and if you click on that, you can answer this question. And I will share screen so we can see the results as they come in. They come in real time, so we can see people's thoughts. So if you click that link, you can share, and I will share in the meantime. So what does cultural authenticity look like for you? Okay. Being able to show up 100% as yourself without fear of repercussions or microaggressions. The ability to talk freely about life outside of work without judgment. Being able to freely talk about personal mental health challenges. Respecting your own cultures and beliefs while also being a safe space for others to do the same. Honesty, even to the point of bluntness, but kindly expressed. Knowing that I can share about myself without being labeled negatively. I'm not faced with questions or comments that buckets me into, oh, my content, which continent my country is located. Confident seeing many cultures reflected in the workplace and honored. Yes, these are all great. And we see that authenticity looks different for everyone because we are not all the same. It's not a monolith. We show up differently, and we want to have a space where we're able to do that safely, and still be able to do our work, right? Acceptance and understanding looks like the community we serve. Yes, I love that. And you can keep sharing here. We'll be able to access these responses, and you can go back and look as well. Being able to talk about traditions and celebrations unique to each of our own backgrounds without fear of judgment by those who don't share the same ones. Yes. Being able to enjoy being yourself in all aspects, food, health, music, etc., and to also be supported and advocated for if challenges arise. Because this is a great segue into jumping into the workbook. So we can take a look and see what that looks like together. So let's jump in. Make sure you all can see my screen. Are you all seeing the workbook?
Yes.
Thumbs up? Okay. So we'll start from the beginning here. And you've seen this cover before. We've used it in our presentations, but this is just jumping into the workbook and some of what you'll see, some of what we outlined in our first presentation about what this workbook includes, why this workbook. So talking about that research that we did, that those interviews that were conducted, and how this is guidance for positive change in organizations, not just for the organization itself, but the people in it, right? Because the people make up the organization. About how to use this workbook and starting with intentionality, and how it's a very deliberate approach, how we approach this, what are the optimal outcomes and use, uh, and how this is an effort to enhance the organization. So as we outlined before, these are the contents. And so we will start with chapter 1. So we look through some of the activities that are outlined here. We talk about cultivating authenticity in the workplace and kind of talking through some questions, some ideas that you can read through. So what is authenticity? What does it mean to be true to yourself? What are the benefits? How it impacts individuals and teams? And kind of really walking through this. And then what is leadership's role? So as we outlined previously, we really want to take an approach where we talked about what it meant to you personally, what it meant for allies in the organization, and then what it meant for leadership. So you'll see that kind of thread throughout the workbook, as you can see here in this chapter. But what does it mean to be empowered? How do you authentically empower folks in the workplace? And then what is leadership's role in that? What role does leadership play in being a pivotal part of creating a culture that encourages authenticity? How do leaders lead by example? How do you create this space that so many of you all mentioned in our Mentimeter that is open, where you don't feel fear of retaliation for showing up as who you are, for your culture and what things that you celebrate and the way that you live? So how do you actively listen, recognize and celebrate diverse perspectives, and ensure that folks feel valued for their unique contributions? And then we continue on with some exercises for leadership, how to encourage authenticity among team members, some steps you can take there. So being vulnerable when you're leading, strength spotlight, have team members identify and share their strengths, create opportunities for them to apply that in the daily tasks and projects. One of the things that I love about where we are and where we work is that it's very strengths based. So what are your strengths? What can you bring to the table? And so being able to create an organization where folks can say, this is who I am, this is how I show up, and this is how it can bring value to the company. And then an opportunity to have feedback and recognition as a part of your authenticity in the workplace. Provide regular means to do that, not just something that's a one-off. While big celebrations are good, what are we doing in the everyday to show our gratitude, to recognize and provide feedback opportunities for folks and acknowledge what they bring to the organization? You have personal reflection, so exploring your authentic self. Take some time to reflect, and we have some questions you can do there. We also have a space for notes, and then we have some questions to consider. And actually, I want to jump in with this one.
Yep, absolutely. So this is an exercise that you would potentially use the workbook for in the workplace, right? So let's say that you are supervising a team, or let's say that you're leading a component of your staff meeting, or let's say you're doing one-on-one with your supervisor and you're like, this is something I really want to think about. These questions are part of this workbook that we've been looking at. Let's think through them together. And so we thought it might be a good opportunity for us to take a couple minutes today, not too much, because we know that our time together is limited, but we wanted to give some space today for folks to look at or think through the questions here. So what we're going to do is we're going to put folks in groups. I love to share. If folks are not able to participate in a group, please don't click off. We will come back together and cover some more materials from the workbook. So don't leave if you're not able to participate in a breakout group. If you are able to participate in a breakout group, I think it'll be very nice to begin to facilitate or be present in some these conversations. But the first question is, and if you are not able to join a group, it's okay. We just won't put you in one. So how can organizations foster an environment of authenticity in the workplace where employees feel comfortable expressing their true selves without fear of judgment or repercussion? What strategies can leaders employ to promote authenticity among team members, encouraging them to bring their genuine perspectives and ideas to the tables? In what ways do an authentic work culture, in which ways does an authentic workplace culture positively impact employee engagement, job satisfaction, overall organizational performance? And then last but certainly not least, what potential challenges or barriers may hinder the cultivation of authenticity in the workplace? And how can organizations address or overcome them? So we will share this this actual page in the work group so you can see them. You might want to grab a picture of it. We also upload a file so that you can have it, the questions. And in the groups, we just ask that you pick one or two. We're not going to spend a lot of time. You might get through one, you might get through two. We'll spend about 10 minutes in those groups, and then we'll come back together and debrief as a larger group. Any questions before I place folks into breakout rooms? Okay. Great. Awesome. Welcome back. So I just have two asks. If you share anything, like if I was in a group with Ronnie and Ronnie gave this amazing example, I just asked that I wouldn't say, Ronnie told us about her cousin and, tell Ronnie's story without Ronnie's permission. So it's very possible that someone shared a story that resonated with them in that smaller group environment that they may not have shared in the space. So feel welcome to ask someone like, hey, can I mention something that you said? But otherwise, I'd love to hear from people's own perspectives. Was something that came up in that small group conversation, or, what's the takeaway that you've had from your group discussion? How about someone from room one? That was Eunice, Amanda, Asher, T.
I'll go.
Okay. Yeah.
I don't remember which room we were in, but I'm Tiba. I'm in New Orleans. And so we talked about, we focused on question 4 and talking about when you at I guess the mid-level in management or in with your team, how you can you have these ideas or you bring the authenticity or you get the best out of your work group and you create this environment of trust and productivity, but then that's as far as you go, right? When there's a disconnect with upper management. And so I get to manage my department and my program. And so I get to implement all of these amazing things and get my team members to work in their authentic selves and work in my team's strength. But we only get to do that in this box, right? Mm. So when you have directors and managers and all of those other teams, and you only represent your department and not quite so much as the organization.
Yeah.
And so that can be that's a challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I wonder, even in those situations when a department starts to really thrive, what's the first thing people start to ask when a particular department is thriving? What do folks think? What happens when a department begins to thrive? A unit begins to thrive. A team begins to thrive. What are they doing? What are they doing, right? And then when two teams begin to thrive, 2 units, 2 departments begin to thrive. When we talk a lot of times, what are they doing different than everyone else? So a lot of times when I doing like organizational work, one of the bigger barriers that we come up against is the discouragement that can happen when culture change is being prioritized by a single individual, a group of people, a department, right? But then we're looking at this whole organization as a whole. And it's like the people who are in these roles are not like open to the change. And it feels like we're just like in this smaller group of people who are desperately committed to doing this work. And I always say that a big part of culture change is like the acknowledgement of change fatigue. There's going to be people who are resistant or reluctant to change, but the outcome of creating more inclusive, authentic, equitable spaces speaks for itself, because the work that begins to happen, the outcomes that are produced will eventually begin to move the spectrum of what culture is in an organization. And for most organizations, the biggest hump is the consistency in doing that work for that department, for that unit, for that group of folks, and being so consistent with it that it has enough time to have an organizational impact. And so a lot of what we're combating is the experience, the perception that's rooted in data of what is happening all else around. But certainly for organizations that stick to it or groups that stick to it, we start to see the culture change where people who might be resistant, where that barrier that might be resistant is put in a place where their inherent goals or interest conversion, if you want to use some theory behind it, if we're looking at it from a theoretical framework, that interest conversion begins to happen and culture change begins to take the priority. We see that happen often. Yeah, it's a really great point. Anyone else? It doesn't matter which group you are in. So we're going to jump back into some of the slides. If things come up, please share them. We'd love to hear from you. We're going to jump back into the slides and try to cover a little bit of the second portion. Let me know if it looks okay on your end. The second part of the workbook that we wanted to show is around identity and mental health. Now I'll turn it over to Ronnie to get us kicked off.
Thank you. So in the second chapter, we discuss identity and mental health and about creating workspaces, like many of you said when we asked those questions in the beginning, that really support your mental health, that support dealing with identity-based stress responses, that support understanding, dealing with and addressing microaggressions, and what that looks like, defining that, giving exercises around identity-based stress, those responses that can show up and how to deal with those things. So chapter 2 really dives deeply into those topics, and we will share that with you. And is everyone seeing the workbook? Can you see the workbook?
Yes.
Okay. So this is more of chapter 2. Chapter 1, there's lots of stuff there, just in case you thought that was the end of it with those questions. There are lots of other activities there. But as we jump into section 2, so that same sort of structure, thinking about how to embrace it, what does it look like, the intersections and impacts, and then creating a safe space. And then we talk about navigating identity and mental health. So what are some strategies for challenges? So cultivating self-awareness, seeking support, mindfulness and stress management. We talk about affinity groups. And then what is that self-care for identity exploration, some techniques for maintaining mental wellness. We talk about regular self-check-ins, boundary setting, mindful practices, and positive affirmations, and really walking you through what that looks like and encouraging you to try some of that out. And then we get into the stress response, and what that looks like, how it can affect you. What does it mean? What is the perception of a threat? How do you activate? How is the stress response activated? What are some of the physiological changes that happen? Then we get into flight or fight, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, but how does that trigger and what do you do when that happens, right? And some of the effects of stress response and how that shows up. It's not just, avoidance, and some of the things we associated with not wanting to do work, but also the physical things that could happen, weight loss, muscle aches, dizziness, some of the emotional things that could happen, in addition to those kind of behavioral ways it shows up, and some of the long-term effects. And we have an assessment here for you. Ashley, if you want to jump in and
Yep. So we have some assessments and exercises and daily check-ins. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight here, particularly when it comes to the implementation of it, and Ronnie, we can pull down this screen. I'll close out with this. But if I were to say to you all in this room right now, get ready to type in the chat because I'm going to ask you a question. If I were to ask you in this room right now, what would you do if you realize in this moment that there was a lion in the room that you're in right now? what would you do? Run.
Good answer, John.
Scream. Climb on top of something. Faint. Freak out. Yeah. What might other folks do? Anyone do anything different? Get behind something, hide. Yeah. Find a hiding spot. Yep. Check for barriers, weapons, call animal control. Absolutely. Right. One time I asked this question and someone's like came from a family of zookeepers and they had very practical steps for me. And I was like, okay. Reply radical, acceptance T. Yeah, I mean, that is a response. That is a response, right? Well, there's all these different things that folks would potentially do, and maybe even some other things I've had folks tell me, kind of along the lines of T's except radical acceptance joke. Some people say, like, I don't know, I'd try to feed the lion. Lion's probably like the leftover of my breakfast sandwich, or the snack that I had. There's no windows, Asher. And so obviously, we're like highlighting the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And we're talking about fight, or freeze response, and it's really easy to kind of like wrap our minds around when we think of something tangible, like a physical lion being in the room. We know what we're going to do. We're going to fight the lion. We're going to run. We're going to freeze and hide behind something. We're going to fawn. We're going to try to appease. And when we think about these different types of trauma response, these are natural. This is our autonomic nervous system, our in activation, right? But when we successfully escape from this lion, that parasympathetic system starts to activate, and you start to cry or release, or I can't believe whatever that is. You get that activation of the parasympathetic nervous system. And so when we start to think about something like what Ronnie was just showing, that not being your authentic self, experiencing a disconnect between your identity and your workplace, it has these inherent consequences to our overall health and well-being. And the reality of it is that it's often not a line in the room. But when we come to talk about workplaces, that line in the room is a stressful conversation you have to have with your supervisor. That line in the room is the person you have to address in work after they've experienced a microaggression against them. The lion in the room are these day-to-day interactions that we have. And so one of the things that I encourage folks to do, are thinking about, what does fight, flight, freeze, and fawn look like in the workplace? So let's think about some of the things that people, concerns that folks would have with colleagues, right? Maybe someone is, always taking on different things and overfilling their place. That might be a fawning response, because in other spaces, if they didn't do that, there were different consequences for it. Or maybe someone's procrastinating, right? They're hiding from the role because they're not actually really sure or clear, and asking for help has been used against them in different places. So they hide, right? So maybe someone is often calling out or leaving early, and you're like, this person is not engaged or wanting to be part of the community. Maybe that flight response is about some aspect of not feeling comfortable or welcome in the environment. Maybe this person's defensive, and everyone's like, oh, you don't want to work with this person. This person's defensive. Maybe that defensiveness is in response to something they're encountering each and every day when they're walking through. So when we start to see these things that would be typically characterized as like, these unpleasant work culture dynamics, it can give us an opportunity to maybe pivot that thought and look at it a bit differently and say, what trauma response is being activated for people to engage more in a more profound conversation about how people are experiencing the workplace, to create that more inclusive, this more engaged environment that's so essential for us to have for our wellness, and particularly when we get into that section on mental health. So we would love for you, we're excited for you to see the different components of it. We will go back through. I realized that I skipped all over the section on white dominant cultural ideological norms. So we'll go back through section 1 and 2 briefly before getting into section 3 and 4, which covers microaggressions and action in the workplace, as well as we'll go through some of the resources that are part of the workbook too, and talk about how you might be able to apply those when we come together next week for our final session. We're so grateful that you took the time out of your day to be here with us today. We do have the evaluation that's there in the chat. You also get it after the session. And if you haven't signed up for day 3, there's a link to do so. Feel welcome to share it with whomever you want. Everyone's welcome. So we hope to see you next week and have a great rest of your day. Anything from you, Ronnie?
No, thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to you coming back to us next week.